Reboot by AmyTintera. Performed by Christine Vam. Chapter 1. They always screamed. My assignment wailed as she slipped in the mud, whipping her head around to see if I was gaining on her. I was. Her feet hit solid pavement and she broke into a full sprint. My feet grazed the ground as I chased her, my short legs easily overtaking her panicked attempt at running. I yanked her arm. She hit the ground. The sound that escaped her mouth was more animal than human as she desperately tried to stand. I hated the screaming. I pulled 2 sets of cuffs off my belt and secured them around her wrists and feet. No, she choked out as I attached the leash to her handcuffs. I didn't do it. I wrapped the leash around my hand and ignored her protests as I hauled her to her feet and dragged her down the street, past the crumbling wooden shacks. It wasn't me. I didn't kill nobody. Her movements became wild, almost convulsive, and I turned to glare at her. There's some human left in you, ain't there? She asked, craning her neck to look at the number above the barcode on my wrist. She froze. Her eyes flew from the 178 printed on my skin to my face, and she let out another shriek. No, there was no human left in me. The screaming continued as I led her to the shuttle and threw her inside with the other members of her gang. The metal bars clanged down as soon as I stepped aside, but she didn't try to make a run for it. She dove behind 2 bloodied humans and back, away from me. I turned around, my eyes flicking over the slums. The deserted dirt road stretched out in front of me, dotted with poorly constructed wooden homes. One of them was leaning so heavily to the left I thought it might tip over at the slightest gust of wind. Ren 178, I said, adjusting the camera on my helmet so it pointed straight out. Assignment secure. Assist, Tom 45, a voice on the other end of my comm ordered. In pursuit on Dallas Street, coming up on the corner of Main. I took off down the dirt road and turned into an alley. The stench of rotten trash hanging in the humid air so thick I wanted to bat it away from my face. I sucked in a deep breath and held it in my lungs, trying to block out the smell of the slums. 45 whizzed past the alleyway on the paved road in front of me, his black pants torn and flapping against his skinny legs. He left a liquid trail behind him, I assumed was blood. I darted onto the street and flew past him, the sound of my boots causing the human ahead of us to turn. This one didn't scream. Yet. He stumbled on the uneven road, and a knife fell from his hand and skidded across the pavement. I was close enough to hear his panicked breathing as he dove for it. I reached for him, but he shot to his feet, whirling around and slicing the blade across my stomach. I jumped back as the blood trickled down my midsection, and the human's lips turned up in a triumphant smile, like this was a victory. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. 45 hurled himself at the beefy human, taking them both down. I hadn't trained 45, and it was obvious. Sloppy and impulsive, it was barely faster than the human. Before I could intercede, Beefy took hold of 45's neck, gave his helmet a shove with his palm, and jammed the knife straight through the boy's forehead. I winced as 45 gurgled and slid off him, his bright gold eyes vacant as he hit the dirt. The human scrambled to his feet, doing a few celebratory jumps and making whooping sounds. Yeah, what you got, Blondie? I adjusted my comm, ignoring the human's annoying attempt to bait me. Ren, 178, 45 down. Beefy's smile slid off his face at the mention of my number. Continue. The voice coming through my comm was flat, uninterested. I locked eyes with Beefy. I wanted him to run. I wanted to kick his legs out from under him and smash that triumphant look on his face into the dirt. I took a quick glance down at 45. I wanted it to hurt. Beefy whirled around and raced away from me, pumping his flabby arms as fast as he could. I bit back a smile as I watched him go. I'd let him have a tiny head start. The chase was my favorite part. I leaped over 45's body and the human looked back as I gained on him. I grabbed his shirt and he stumbled with a grunt, his face smacking against the ground. He clawed desperately at the gravel, but it was too late. I jammed my foot into his back as I pulled out my cuffs. I snapped them around his ankles. He screamed, of course. Ren 178, 45's assignment is now secure. Report to the shuttle, the voice in my ear said. I attached a leash to Beefy's wrists, jerking it tighter until he yelped in pain, and tugged him over to Tom 45's body. He was a young kid, maybe 14 or so, just out of training. I avoided his vacant eyes as I roped the leash around his wrists. I lugged them past the sad little wooden houses of the slums and back to the shuttle, the blood crusting on my stomach as the wound closed. I shoved Beefy into the black box with the other humans, who cringed at the mere sight of me. I turned away and headed for the other shuttle, pausing to pull the knife out of Tom 45's head. The door opened and the reboots looked up from their seats, their eyes immediately skipping over me to rest on 45. I pushed aside the nagging voice that said I should have been able to save him, and carefully placed him on the floor. I took a quick glance around the shuttle and found my most recent trainee, Marie 135, strapped into her seat. I scanned her for signs of injury, but didn't see any. She'd survived her first solo mission. Not that I'd expected otherwise. She looked from me to 45 and back again. She'd been silent through most of our training, so I barely knew her any better than I had her first day as a newbie. But I thought the expression on her face was gratitude. My trainees had the best survival rate. I handed the knife to the shuttle officer, who gave me a sympathetic look. Leb was the only officer I could tolerate, the only human I could tolerate for that matter. I took one of the small seats lined up inside the black windowless shuttle, pulling the straps down my chest as I leaned back. I stole a glance up at the other reboots, but they were all looking at 45, sadly. One even wiped at tears on her face, smearing blood and dirt across her cheek in the process. The lower numbers often cried. 45 probably cried. He was only dead 45 minutes before he rose. The less time dead before the reboot, the more humanity retained. I was dead for 178 minutes. I didn't cry. Leb walked to the front of the shuttle and gripped the edge of the open door as he peered inside. "Ready," he said to the officer piloting the shuttle. He pulled the door closed and I heard the lock snap into place. We lifted off the ground as Leb slid into his seat. I shut my eyes until I felt the shuttle land with a jerk. The reboots silently filed out onto the rooftop, and I resisted the urge to look back at 45 one more time as I brought up the rear. I joined the line, pulling my long-sleeved black shirt off to reveal a thin white undershirt. The cool air tickled my skin as I tossed the shirt over my shoulder, spread my legs, and held my arms out like I was trying to fly. I saw a reboot fly once. He jumped off the top of a 15-story building with his arms spread, hit the ground, and tried to drag his broken body to freedom. He made it maybe 2 feet before they put a bullet in his head. A guard, a human who smelled like sweat and smoke, quickly patted me down. He could barely keep the grimace off his face, and I turned to look at the squat little buildings of the slums instead. The guards hated touching me. I think they flipped for it. He jerked his head toward the door, wiping his hands on his pants like he could wash the dead off. Nope. I'd tried. A guard held the door open for me and I slipped through. The top floors of the facility were all staff offices, and I ran down several flights of dark stairs and stopped at the 8th floor. Reboot quarters. Below were 2 more floors reboots were allowed to access on a regular basis. But under that, it was mostly medical research labs I rarely visited. They'd like to examine us occasionally, but they mostly use the space to research human diseases. Reboots don't get sick. I held my barcode out to the guard at the door, and he scanned it and nodded. My boots made little noise on the concrete floor as I made my way down the hall. The girls in my wing were all asleep, or pretending to be. I could see into every room through the glass walls. Privacy was a human right, not a reboot one. 2 girls per room, one in each of the twin beds pushed against either wall, a dresser at the end of both beds, and one wardrobe at the back of the room to share. That's what we called home. I stopped in front of my quarters and waited for the guard to call in the order for someone upstairs to open my door. Only the humans could open the doors once they were locked at night. The doors slid open, and Ever rolled over in her bed as I stepped inside. She hadn't been sleeping much the last few weeks. It seemed she was always awake when I came in after an assignment. Her big, green reboot eyes glowed in the darkness, and she lifted her eyebrows, asking silently how the mission went. Talking after lights out was prohibited. I held up 4 fingers on one hand, 5 on the other, and she let out a little sigh. Her face scrunched up with an emotion I could no longer stir up in myself, and I turned away to loosen the strap of my helmet. I put it on my dresser with my camera and comm and peeled off my clothes. I quickly pulled on sweats. I was cold, always cold, and climbed into my tiny bed. Ever's pretty 56 face was still crumpled in sadness, and I rolled to stare at the wall, uncomfortable. We'd been roommates for 4 years, since we were 13, but I'd never gotten used to the way emotion poured out of her like a human. I closed my eyes, but the sounds of human screams pulsed against my head. I hated the screaming. Their screaming was my screaming. The first thing I remembered after waking up as a reboot was a shrill yell bouncing off the walls and ringing in my ears. I had thought, what idiot is making that noise? It was me. Me, shrieking like a crack addict 2 days out from a fix. Rather embarrassing. I'd always prided myself on being the quiet, stoic one in every situation, the one standing there calmly while the adults lost it. But at the age of 12, when I woke up in the dead room of the hospital, 178 minutes after taking 3 bullets to the chest, I screamed. I screamed as they branded my wrist with my barcode, my number, and my human name, Ren Connolly. I screamed as they locked me in a cell, as they escorted me to the shuttle, as they put me in line with the other newly undead former children. I screamed until I arrived at the Human Advancement and Repopulation Corporation, or HARC, facility, and they told me screaming meant death. Acting like I was still a human child meant death. Disobeying orders meant death. And then I was silent. Chapter 2. Do you think there'll be a hot one this time? Ever asked as I smoothed my black shirt down to my pants. Didn't you think 72 was hot? I asked, turning around to give her an amused look. She liked it when I looked amused. Kind of a jerk, she said. Agreed. I feel like we've had a real dry spell. I laced up my boots, genuine amusement sparking inside me. New reboots arrived about every 6 weeks, a time many saw as an opportunity to replenish the dating pool. We weren't allowed to date, but the birth control chip they shot into the female's arms the first day suggested they knew that that was one rule they couldn't actually enforce. For me, new reboots meant only the start of a new training cycle. I didn't date. The lock on the door to our room clicked, like it did every morning at 7, and the clear door slid open. Ever stepped out, looping her long brown hair into a knot as she waited. She often waited for me in the morning so we could walk to the cafeteria together. I guessed this was a friend thing. I saw the other girls doing it, so I went along with it. I joined her in the hallway, and the pasty human standing just outside our door shrank back at the sight of me. She pulled the stack of clothes she was carrying closer to her chest, waiting for us to leave so she could drop them on our beds. No human working at Hark wanted to enter a small, enclosed space with me. Ever and I headed down the hallway, eyes straight forward. The humans built glass walls so they could see our every movement. Reboots tried to afford one another a smidgen of privacy. The halls were quiet in the mornings, the only sounds, the occasional murmur of voices, and the soft hum of the air conditioning. The cafeteria was one floor down, through a pair of big red doors that warned of the dangers inside. We stepped into the room, which was blindingly white except for the clear glass that lined the upper portion of one wall. Hark officers were stationed at the other side, behind the guns mounted to the glass. Most of the reboots were already there, hundreds of them sitting on little round plastic seats at long tables. The rows of bright eyes shining out against pale skin looked like a string of lights down every table. The smell of death hung in the air, causing most humans who entered to wrinkle their noses. I rarely noticed anymore. Ever and I didn't eat together. Once we got our food, she split off to the table for the under 60s with her tray, and I sat down at the table for 120s and higher. The only one who came close to my number was Hugo, at 150. Marie 135 nodded at me as I sat down, as did a few others. But reboots over 120 minutes dead were not known for their social skills. There was rarely much talking. The rest of the room was noisy, though. The chatter of reboots filled the cafeteria. I bit into a piece of bacon as the red doors at the end of the room opened, and a guard marched in, followed by the newbies. I counted 14. I'd heard a rumor the humans were working on a vaccine to prevent rebooting. It didn't look like they'd succeeded yet. There were no adults among them. Reboots over the age of 20 were killed as soon as they rebooted. If they rebooted. It was uncommon. They ain't right, a teacher once told me when I asked why they shot the adults. The kids ain't all there anymore, but the adults, they ain't right. Even from a distance, I could see some of the newbies shaking. They ranged in age from about 11 or 12 to older teenagers, but the terror that radiated from them was the same. It would have been less than a month since they rebooted, and it took most much longer to accept what had happened to them. They were placed in a holding facility at the hospital in their hometown for a few weeks to adjust, until Hark assigned them to a city. We continued to age like normal humans, so reboots under the age of 11 were held at the facility until they reached a useful age. I'd had to spend only a few days at the holding facility, but it was one of the worst parts of rebooting. The actual building where they kept us wasn't bad, simply a smaller version of where I lived now. But the panic was constant, all-consuming. We all knew there was a good possibility we would reboot if we died. It was almost certain in the slums. But the reality of it was still horrifying. At first, anyway. Once the shock wore off and I made it through training, I realized I was much better off as a reboot than I'd ever been as a human. Rebooting itself was simply a different reaction to the KDH virus. KDH killed most people, but for some, the young, the strong, the virus worked differently. Even those who died of something other than KDH could reboot, if they'd had the KDH virus even once in their lifetime. It rebooted the body after death, bringing it back stronger, more powerful, but also colder, emotionless. An evil copy of what we used to be, the humans said. Most would rather die completely than be one of the lucky ones who rebooted. The guards ordered the newbies to sit. They all did so quickly, already informed that they followed orders or got a bullet in the brain. The guards left, letting the doors slam as they hurried out. Not even our hardened guards liked to be in the presence of so many reboots at once. The laughter and scuffling started right away, but I turned my attention back to my breakfast. The only newbie I had any interest in was my next trainee, but we wouldn't be paired up until tomorrow. The 90s like to break 'em all in right away. Considering the speed at which we healed, I saw no problem with the newbies being roughed up a little. Might as well start toughening them up now. The 90s were rowdier than usual today. I shoved the last piece of bacon in my mouth as the hollering rose to an annoying level. I dropped my tray on top of the trash can and headed for the exit. A flash of color streaked across the white floor, coming to a stop at my feet with a squeak. It was a newbie, shot down the slick tile like a toy. I just missed stepping on his head and planted my boot on the floor. Blood trickled from his nose and a bruise had formed under one eye. His long, lanky legs were sprawled across the floor, his thin white t-shirt clinging to the frame of an underfed former human. His close-cropped black hair matched his eyes, so dark I couldn't find his pupils. They probably used to be brown. Brown eyes usually took on a golden sort of glow after death, but I liked his blackness. It was in stark contrast to the white of the cafeteria, to the glow of the other reboot's eyes. No one came near him now that he was in my space, but someone yelled, 22, and laughed. 22? That couldn't be his number. I hadn't seen anyone under 40 in a few years. Well, there was a 37 last year, but she died within a month. I nudged at his arm with my boot so I could see his barcode. Callum Reyes, 22. I raised my eyebrows. He was only dead 22 minutes before he rebooted. He was practically still human. My eyes shifted back to his face to see a smile spreading across his lips. Why was he smiling? This didn't seem like an appropriate time to be smiling. "Hi," he said, propping himself up on his elbows. "Apparently they call me 22. "It's your number," I replied. He smiled bigger. I wanted to tell him to stop it. "I know. And yours?" I pulled up my sleeve and turned my arm to reveal the 178. His eyes widened, and I felt a surge of satisfaction when his grin faltered. "You're 178? He asked, hopping to his feet. Even humans had heard of me. "Yes," I said. "Really?" His eyes flicked over me quickly. His smile had returned. I frowned at his doubt, and he laughed. "Sorry, I thought you'd be, I don't know, bigger?" "I can't control my height," I said, trying to pull myself up an extra inch or two. Not that it would help. He towered over me, and I had to lift my chin to look him in the eye. He laughed, although I had no idea at what. Was my height funny? His laugh was big, genuine, echoing across the now silent cafeteria. It didn't belong here, that laugh. He didn't belong here, with those full lips curving up with actual happiness. I sidestepped him to walk away, but he grabbed my wrist. A few reboots gasped. No one touched me. They didn't even come near me, except forever. "I didn't catch your name," he said, turning my arm so he could see, oblivious to the fact that this was a weird thing to do. "Ren," he read, releasing me. "I'm Callan. Nice to meet you." I frowned at him over my shoulder as I headed for the door. I didn't know what it was to meet him, but nice was not the word I would have picked. Newbie Day was my favorite. As I headed into the gym later that morning with the other trainers, excitement rippled through my chest. I almost smiled. Almost. The newbies were sitting on the shiny wood floor in the center of the large room, next to several black mats. They turned away from the instructor to look at us, their faces tight with fear. It looked like no one had puked yet. "Don't look at them," Manny 119 barked. He was in charge of wrangling the newbies their first few days here. He'd been doing it for longer than I'd been here, and I figured it was because he was bitter about missing the opportunity to be a trainer by 1 minute. All the newbies focused their attention on Manny, except 22, who gave me that weird smile before turning around. Park medical personnel were lined up against the wall behind Manny, holding their clipboards and some tech equipment I couldn't begin to understand. There were 4 of them today, 3 men and a woman, all dressed in their usual white lab coats. The doctors and scientists always came out to observe the newbies. Later, they would take them down to one of the medical floors to be poked and prodded. "Welcome to Rosa," Manny said, arms crossed over his chest, eyebrows low like he was trying to be scary. Didn't fool me. Not now, and not when I was a 12-year-old newbie. "Your trainers will pick you tomorrow. Today they will observe you," Manny continued. His voice echoed across the gym. It was a giant empty room with dingy white walls that had been stained with blood many times. Manny began listing off their numbers and pointing for our benefit. The highest was 121, a well-built older teenager who probably looked intimidating even as a human. Hark coveted the higher numbers. Me, above all. My body had had more time than most to adapt to the change, so I regenerated and healed faster than any at the facility. Rebooting only occurred after every bodily function shut down. The brain, the heart, the lungs, everything had to go before the process could start. I'd heard the number of minutes dead referred to as a rest, a time for the body to regroup and refresh and prepare for what was next. The longer the rest, the better the reboot. Today was no different. Manny paired off newbies and ordered them to go at it, giving them a chance to impress us. 121 picked up the fighting quickly, his partner a bloody mess within minutes. Callum, 22, spent more time on the floor than standing in front of his shorter, younger partner. He was clumsy and his long limbs went everywhere except where he wanted. He moved like a human, as though he'd never rebooted at all. The lower numbers didn't heal as fast, and they had too much leftover human emotion. When humans first began rising from the dead, they called it a miracle. Reboots were a cure for the virus that had wiped out most of the population. They were stronger and faster and almost invincible. Then, as it became apparent a reboot wasn't the human they'd known, but a sort of cold, altered copy, they called us monsters. The humans shut out the reboots, banished them from their homes, and eventually decided the only course of action was to execute every one of them. The reboots retaliated, but they were outnumbered and lost the war. Now, we are slaves. The reboot project began almost 20 years ago, a few years after the end of the war, when Hark realized putting us to work was far more useful than simply executing every human who rose. We didn't get sick. We could survive with less food and water than a human. We had a higher threshold for pain. We might have been monsters, but we were still stronger and faster and far more useful than any human army. Well, most of us anyway. The lower numbers were more likely to die in the field, making training them a waste of my time. I always picked the highest number. "I give 22 6 months," Ross 149 said from beside me. He rarely said much, but I got the feeling he enjoyed training as much as I did. It was exciting, the possibility of shaping a scared, useless reboot into something much better. 3, Hugo countered. "Wonderful," Lissy muttered under her breath. At 124, she was the lowest of the trainees, and therefore got last pick of newbies. 22 would be her problem. "Maybe if you trained them better, all your newbies wouldn't get their heads chopped off," Hugo said. Hugo had been my trainee 2 years ago, and he was just ending his first year as a trainer. He already had an excellent track record of keeping his newbies alive. "Only one got his head chopped off," Lissy said, pressing her hands against the messy curls that sprang from her head. "The others were shot," I said, "and 45 got a knife through the head." 45 was hopeless, Lissy spat. She glared at the floor, most likely lacking the courage to turn that glare on me. 178, Manny called, motioning me over. I walked across the gym floor into the center of the circle the newbies had made on the ground. Most avoided eye contact. "Volunteer?" Manny asked them. 22's hand shot up. The only one. I doubt he would have volunteered if he had known what was coming. "Up," Manny said. 22 bounced to his feet, a smile of ignorance plastered on his face. "Your broken bones will take 5 to 10 minutes to heal, depending on your personal recovery time," Manny said. He nodded at me. I grabbed 22's arm, twisted it behind his back, and cracked it with one quick thrust. He let out a yell and jerked the arm away, cradling it against his chest. The newbie's eyes were wide, watching me with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Try to punch her," Manny said. 22 looked up at him, the pain etched all over his face. "What?" "Punch her," Manny repeated. 22 took a hesitant step toward me. He swung at me, weakly, and I leaned back to miss it. He doubled over in pain, a tiny whimper escaping from his throat. "You're not invincible," Manny said. "I don't care what you hurt as a human. You feel pain, you can get hurt. And in the field, 5 to 10 minutes is too long to be incapacitated." He gestured at the other trainers, and the newbies' faces fell as they realized what was coming. The cracks reverberated through the gym as the trainers broke each of their arms. I never liked this exercise much. Too much screaming. The point was to learn to push aside the pain and fight through it. Each broken bone hurt just as much as the last. The difference was how a reboot learned to work through it. A human would lie on the ground sobbing. A reboot didn't acknowledge pain. I looked down at 22, who had slumped to the ground, his face scrunched up in agony. He looked up at me, and I thought he might yell. They usually yelled at me after I broke their arms. "You're not going to break anything else, are you?" he asked. "No, not right now." "Oh, so later then. Great, I'll look forward to that." He winced as he looked down at his arm. Manny pointed for the trainers to go back to the wall and gestured for the newbies to come to him. "You should get up," I said to 22. Oblivious to Manny's glare, 22 slowly got to his feet, raising an eyebrow at me. "Are we doing my leg next?" he asked. "Can I get some warning next time? A quick, 'Hey, I'm going to snap your bone with my bare hands right now. Brace yourself.'" One of the trainers behind me snorted, and Manny snapped his fingers impatiently. "Get over here, 22, and sit. Quietly." I joined the trainers, taking a quick glance at 22 as he plopped down in the circle. He was still watching me, his eyes sparkling, and I quickly looked away. What a strange newbie.